What does the Bible say about sexual violence, abuse, rape, sexual trafficking, and sexual slavery? Throughout history, millions of underage girls and women have been subject to the supposed divine commands of what you're about to hear. The panelists you're about to see are all Bible scholars with expertise in the very subject we are discussing. This video will likely not be advertiser friendly, reducing its effectiveness in the YouTube algorithm. As a result, we need as many people to share this video as possible. Let's see if we can get to 50 people to tweet, post, email, fax, carrier pigeon this video out. And lastly, this channel runs off donations. If you can support Deep Drinks financially, please consider joining the Patreon or YouTube channel. Thank you. For me, I was quite shocked to see sex slavery in there. I don't know if I really absorbed that concept until I kind of saw it written out in your slides. Can you go into a little bit more detail into what that is? Like, what is sexual slavery?
Yeah, I mean, I think before I do, one of the things that we need to make sure that we do in this type of a discussion is to distinguish between what they considered to be X and what we would consider to be X. And this sort of gets problematic in apologetic discussions, because when we talk about something like rape, it's very clear that many laws in the ancient world, including the Hebrew Bible, would endorse something that we today would consider to be rape. However, those same legal sections, they might not have viewed, and often did not view, that particular action under the category of rape, right? And so what you often have happening here is an apologist will say, no, rape is not endorsed, or rape is not allowed or condoned in the Old Testament laws, whereas, you know, someone in academia would say, yeah, it is. But the disconnect is because, you know, the apologist is saying, well, the Bible is not calling that rape, which in one sense is a really important thing to recognize, right? If we're looking at what it is that they considered to be X. But in this particular discussion, generally speaking, the more important thing is, I guess in the apologetics discussion, I think it's far more common for the more important thing to be what we would consider to be X. And the reason for that is that the apologist then has to defend something that they know to be, or they believe themselves to be, immoral, as they define it when seen in the Hebrew Bible. So, okay, all of that being said, and please, anybody jump in and just shut me up if you want. But oh yes, please.
Well, I just want to, like, people are losing their minds right now about someone saying that David raped Bathsheba. I'm like, right. Yes, he did. And that is different from laws that say this is how you sell your daughter into slavery to a man who's going to use her for sex. But those second parts aren't said in the laws, right? I mean, there are two different things going on, and they're both happening, and they're both related to this issue of sex, and they thought about it differently than we do, right? I don't know. Is that a helpful piece of what you're getting at here, Josh?
Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to add that I think our concept of a person and rights and things like that is also phenomenally distinct from how they conceptualize personhood anciently. Even today, we understand that there are phases of personhood and degrees of personhood, but anciently it was quite a bit different. Women weren't granted full personhood, legal, moral personhood that we would recognize today. And really, the men were the main possessors of that personhood. And so the consent of a woman in a sexual encounter isn't even on the table. It doesn't even compute anciently. It would be like asking how they felt about the Denver Broncos anciently. It doesn't compute. There's no framework for that. And so for people who say, well, to argue about who's consenting, who's not, who's seeking consent, it wasn't even a question. It did not matter what a woman thought. And so they may not have thought of that as a violation of her autonomy or her agency or her consent. And for us today to say, well, today, that's what we call sexual assault, sexual violence, rape, all of these things. And I think one of the knots, and we'll get into this more in the apologetics portion of this discussion, but one of the knots that apologetics require people tie themselves into is bridging the gap between that's how they thought about it anciently. This is how we think about it today. But at the same time, the person governing all this is supposed to be unchanging and eternal and have the same position, irrespective, unless we get into ideas of accommodationism. And there we go, getting into knots. And so I think it's important that we distinguish these ideas about personhood. And they didn't even, when Moses conquers and I haven't read this chapter in a while, the Ammonites, and they say all the women who have known a man, kill them. All the women who have not yet known a man, take them, keep them for yourselves. That's pretty clearly going to result in this sex slavery. These are conquered people taken in battle, and so they fit perfectly into what you were allowed to take as property. So they were more property than person, and so they had no agency to be considered.
Yeah, and I think that like the Deuteronomy 22 thing is really the prime example of that, where it actually, like Deuteronomy 20, is it 28 and 29 or somewhere in Deuteronomy 22, it outlines literally what you do when a man finds a virgin, rapes her, and then has decreased her value, so she's no longer a commodity that can be sold. He just has to pay the father. And then he marries the virgin, or the no longer virgin, I guess. And then he I think he can't divorce her either, right? It's like, so I mean, you end up with this situation where it's like, it doesn't say she becomes your sex slave for life, but what it says is that like she has the value of a certain amount of silver that you have to pay the father, and so like it endorses rape and slavery in my opinion in that text. Like it's saying, well, rape happens, just take her as your sex slave.
Because what woman doesn't want to marry her rapist? Like,
it's a pretty good way to ensure that you get the woman that you want, I think, from the perspective of a man, right? Well, all you have to do is just rape her,
and it's not even really a punishment. Like it's not criminalizing the act.
No.
It's saying in the interest of social order, so that this person is not now outcast in society, left adrift. You just need to take care of them. And so it's like, hey, if you're going to do this, be aware that these are the consequences. And it's not
do it right.
Yeah.
And if anybody, just very quickly, and Kip, but if anybody's actually concerned that what we're saying here about, for example, Deuteronomy 22 is not accurate or is not consensus, I mean, obviously there are lots and lots of places that you could read, but I have an entire chapter dedicated to just rape and adultery in the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible in the legal sections. And there's an extensive bibliography, and it's very heavily footnoted. So like I deal with all of that. And again, it's just, this is the consensus view.
Yeah.
So I noticed someone raised a question in the chat when I glanced at it about, I mean, we've been talking about this, about the Bible's position on marital rape. And it's important to point out that, it's as Dan said, like this is not even a concept that enters their worldview, like on any level. But also important to point out is that this is not a concept that really entered any social discussion until, really tragically, very, very recently.
Yeah, I was going to say 30.
Right?
Well, it's not even in some people's discussions.
Yeah,
like,
there are still people on Twitter saying marital rape is not a thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's been legislated that way. Yeah.
I just have to point out too, the big thing for me is that this text, that like if you take the perspective that the writers of the Bible were people living in their time, great, fine, totally cool. It gets a little trickier when you say that these were instructions from an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe that doesn't change. That's when all of a sudden it's like, well, how dare us? How dare we change society's standards? Like they'll say, oh, you're being woke. What's wrong, to be anti-marital rape? So I think it's important to kind of draw out that the difference there is, and Ben Shapiro likes to say this, the difference is it's not that slavery was kind of everywhere. First, it wasn't. There were different cultures that didn't have slavery at the time, like the Jains he mentions, and the Aboriginal Australians didn't necessarily have slavery. But it's that we're also led to believe by these same people that these were instructions from God.
And if I could, because then maybe you can talk about another aspect of it, but I think it's important. We've sort of talked about some of the rape aspects of slavery and the Numbers 31 aspect, but there are very clear slavery laws that stipulate what we're describing here. So, and it's often missed, I think, in just a cursory reading. So if you look at Exodus 21, 2-6, you have the laws about the male debt slave. First of all, it's missed that the woman that he marries and their children are chattel slaves, and they remain that way. People miss that all the time. But what is his use? And this is really critical. Women are not the only ones that become sex slaves. He is being used even as a debt slave, even as an Israelite debt slave. He's being used for a sexual capacity because he's being used to
breed more
aid
slaves.
in breeding slaves, houseborn slaves.
Yeah.
But I think more dastardly, I suppose, when you look at verses 7-11, this is the Amah, this is the female slave that is being sold into concubinage. And again, like there is, as everybody's been pointing out here, like there is no concern for what her opinion on the matter is, but the way that she is being used is sexually, be it for reproductive purposes or just for a sexual gratification. But I mean, these are very clear examples in the legal sections that are specifically dealing with slaves that describe this sort of sexual slavery.
I think there's an interesting difference to note between Exodus 21's treatment of the female slave and Deuteronomy's treatment. And I think what Exodus is kind of trying to do is, once the woman sells herself into slavery, she's obviously tainted goods from then on. If she's released after 6 years, there's not really much that she can do within the structure of their society at the time. She can't really go and find a valid marriage or anything like that, which suggests the point of buying a female slave is obviously fundamentally sexual in nature. But then Deuteronomy changes that. And I've been curious, you've done a lot more research on this than I have. Josh, what's the thinking on what the point of Deuteronomy's revision of this law might be?
I mean, it's debated. It's debated whether it is, and I tend to think that it is revising for that reason, just because of the way the syntax is. But it's debated whether this is talking about just a general service female slave, someone that's being used for labor, but not for sexual capacities. So she's not being taken into concubinage. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are people that make the argument. But I mean, the way that it's placed, it's like, the law is set out, and then it says the end, and you'll also do this for your female slaves, which seems sort of, tacked on-ish.
Yeah, an afterthought.
Yeah, so...
And I don't remember if it's been explicitly stated, but the difference is, according to Exodus, a female slave does not get released after 6 years, but is permanent. Whereas in Deuteronomy, it does say your male and your female slaves after 6 years. And the laws of Hammurabi were quite a bit more just, putting it at 3 years, I believe. Is that accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
The thing that I see, I went through, like I said, we made 29 pages of apologetic claims. I lost years of my life making that thing. But I will say that what apologists will often say, and we can get into this in the apologetics section, which will be the funnest part, I think, is they'll say, well, it never said that they would have sex with the little girls that they took as plunder. Like it's, and it never says that, and it never says, as someone pointed out on Twitter, it never says that that the woman was chattel slavery. It just says that she's not to go with the husband. She's still got to serve out her 7 years. What would you say to someone who says that?
Me or anybody?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess.
I mean, it just doesn't
you got
say
the
that.
con.
I think right away.
I mean, it's just
one
like
of the things that I would point out, and then Josh can continue. But my instant pushback on these sorts of claims is I think the critical thing to recognize here is there was no protection against these sorts of things happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, in Numbers 31, first of all, sick flex, bruh, right? Like, I mean, read the passage and it says, like, guess what they are? They're numbered as plunder, right? So here are the cattle, and here's how many women you get, right? And we have to make sure we set aside a certain number of those for this other tribe. It's like, so really, this is what you want to say about it? Right. But the other thing that you were talking about, and this is sort of a Paul Copan-y sort of thing to do. It's become an adjective now, Paul Copan. Or I guess it'd be an adverb. No, the adjective, and that's anyway. I will do it called panely. Would be the adverb, but is like, oh well, what's the guy going to do in Exodus 21:2-6? So just very, very quickly for everybody. The law is saying, here's the main law is if a male slave gets sold as an Israelite or sells himself as a debt slave, he serves for 6 years. That takes care of the entirety of his debt, whatever it is, interest, room and board, whatever. It's all taken care of. He gets set free, no debt. Then it says, well, what do you do if he came in single? He leaves single. If he comes in married to somebody, he leaves married to that person. Like they all go out, right? So however you come in, that's how you go out. But then the question comes up, well, what happens if the master gives him a wife during that 6-year term of service? And the law is explicit that the woman and any children that they produce together are the property of the master. Well, Paul Copan comes up to this and says, well, like, what do we make of this? Well, I mean, certainly it can't be what it says, right? Yeah. Right? So let's put on our thinking caps and see what we can come up with. Sorry, that's not nice, but I mean that's how it comes across, Paul. Sorry. And he says like, well, maybe the husband can go out and he can like save up his shekels and maybe like buy her freedom, or maybe. But the thing is, well, maybe he could just wait out the rest of her contract. Well, the problem is there is no contract. Right. Take the woman out of the picture for a minute. Where's the contract for the kid? Right. What debt did the kid fall into that now he's serving as a slave? Like, I mean, in other words, this is just taking the ancient Near Eastern context and the passage itself and just sort of going, blah, 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 like we're not listening to that. Right. And trying to come up with something that makes it. No, these are chattel slaves. And again, I'll shut up. But this isn't Josh talking. And it's not anybody else on the panel talking. Go read any of the books that are currently here on this cool little whatever shelf that is. It's a bunch of my slave books because I'm writing the 2nd edition of this book now. Like it's just everybody's echoing exactly what we're saying, and they're the subject matter experts in the field.